Chapter 3 On the Town. Page 26. The body was found by a couple of women jogging on the outdoor track at Fall River's Diamond Regional Vocational Technical High School at 7:30 on the morning of October 13th, 1979. It was under the steel frame bleachers, lying in its own blood. Because it was so small, barely 5 feet tall, and weighing less than 90 pounds, the victim appeared to have been little more than a child. Also, at first glance, the crime scene looked like a case of grape schmurder. All the girl's clothing had been removed except for her blouse. The skull had been crushed by multiple blows with a blunt object, probably only 2 or 3 hours earlier that same morning. But the wrists and ankles were bound with twine and fishing line, which implied far more premeditation than goes into a typical sex crime, and a closer examination of the body and the clothes that were recovered showed signs of a deliberate effort to hide the victim's identity. The autopsy produced no medical evidence of sexual assault. Police recovered several blood-spattered rocks from the murder site, and in addition to the multiple skull fractures, the medical examiner found stab wounds on the back of the head. She had not been bludgeoned by a single instrument. Captain Reese assigned a senior detective named Paul Carey to run the investigation, and under Carey, he assigned Alan Sylvia and Tom Joachim. The Massachusetts State Police were also in on the investigation from the beginning, as was Assistant DA from the Office of Bristol County District Attorney Ron Pena. Reese released a composite picture of the victim to the media in the hope of discovering her identity, but he did not release all the details to the press, nor did he release any of the conclusions drawn by the medical examiner from the evidence gathered at the site. It was an important assignment for Sylvia and Joachim, and they were pleased with the new chain of command. Paul Carey had in common with the Knighters that he was something of an outsider. He had not grown up in Fall River, but in Boston. Besides that, he gave the impression of being a loner by nature. He belonged to a local motorcycle club. He did not look or act particularly like a policeman. Most importantly of all, they liked him. Beneath his cynical but easy personality, they recognized the doggedness and slightly warped imagination that compromised a natural instinct for the street. The body was not identified for another 24 hours after the victim's father saw the composite portrait and read a description of the clothing in the New Bedford Sunday Standard Times. Her name was Doreen Ann Levesque. She was 17. One of the reasons it took so long to identify Doreen was that she did not belong in Fall River. She had lived in New Bedford with her parents and 6 younger siblings. Her father told police she sometimes stayed out overnight with friends, and he had assumed that was why she had not returned on Friday night. Raising children is difficult in any circumstance, and both Fall River and New Bedford are cities of large families. It was the kind of situation that people could readily understand and sympathize with. On Tuesday, 3 days after her death, the newspaper revealed that Doreen had been in the state's program for children in need of services and had received counseling for a year under the supervision of the court. In case of violent crime and mystery, the news media sometimes treat that kind of information as a bellwether, the vanguard of a still unseen army of damning facts that can be expected to follow. But there was no sense of that in the Standard Times, and the new revelation was not offered in a way that suggested the victim had somehow invited her fate. "Today's world is tough," her father was quoted. "It's not the same world that my wife and I grew up in." Reporters showed up at the funeral 2 days later. Paul Fitzgerald, one of the state troopers on the case, told them there were still no real clues to the killings, adding that the area around the Diamond playing field was a popular parking spot for teenagers. The high point of the service was the reading of Doreen's poetry and a letter she had written some months before to Jesus. "Dear Jesus," it said, I hope I spelled your name right. Thank you for everything you've done for me and anything you might do. Someday, I would like to be with you in heaven. If I have trouble following you, I'd like for you to help me. She was buried in a white casket in the Mother Seton section of St. John's Cemetery. But the early image of the victim that had taken root in the press and budded in the public imagination began to wither badly the following Sunday, when the Standard Times published a front-page report on Doreen Levesque's brief life. "My daughter went the whole route," her mother was quoted as saying. "Drugs, alcohol, whatever went on in the streets, she was aware of it, because she was a part of it. She had been in trouble almost steadily since the age of 12. She was arrested for shoplifting, ran away from home, twice dropped out of school, and lived with a succession of friends who had taken her in to keep her off the streets. There was a strong implication that she was a prostitute." Prostitution was not just a casual embarrassment in the New Bedford and Fall River. It was a major industry that drew on a laboring pool extending as far away as New York, New Jersey, and even Florida. Some 40% of the population of both cities is Portuguese, either by descent or direct immigration, and a quarter are French. Those populations, like every other, vary widely, but on balance they have their own particular levels of cultural tolerance. Prostitution was not something either city was proud of, but it could be abided. When it involved their own children, however, there were other things the public wanted to read about. The newspaper gave that to them as well. There was more about the letter to Jesus, and the article revealed that Doreen had been bothered by the notion that God had allowed his son to suffer on the cross. She had removed the small figure of Jesus from her crucifix, placing it in a little box under a small blanket, and she slept with the statue of Christ beside her bed. She also wrote poetry about the pain of growing up, about disappointed love, about separation, death, and screwed up lives. The article described her terrible self-consciousness about being short, revealing that she wore high heels and developed a compensating strut. She was quoted by friends as saying she was not long for this world and that probably she'd be happier when she passed. The mother of a friend said Doreen would do almost anything for affection. This was still reassuring, familiar ground, filled with the same icons of faith, the same hopes, uncertainties, pains, and failures that marked the lives of most of the readers of that story. Even in describing her as different, the article maintained Doreen's position as one of their own. However she had lived, her place on the mainstream of another major local tradition was virtually assured by the manner of her death. That was the tradition of bizarre murders involving women. What Reese had held back when he spoke with the press was the fact that Paul de Villers, the county medical examiner, had determined that Doreen's murder had probably been committed by more than one person. He also suspected that the mutilation of the body was more than an attempt to hide the girl's identity. It appeared to have involved elements of ritual. Instead of a lethal beating in the wake of a rape, the evidence pointed to the possibility of torture and unaliving by stoning. The first Fall River murder to attain national prominence occurred nearly a century and a half earlier in 1832, when the body of a local factory worker named Sarah Cornell was discovered one December morning next to a haystack on the Durfee farm in what has since become the south side of the city. She was hanging from a pole, and the body had been arranged in a manner suggesting she unalived herself. After the funeral, however, William Durfee, who had gone to sea as a young man, examined the knot in the rope which had choked her. It was a clove hitch, he announced, and even with the weight of her body, it could not have been pulled tight with both ends held together, as they were when the rope was found around her neck. She had been strangled, and then her body was placed on the pole. The corpse was exhumed, and a medical examiner confirmed that she had first been beaten, then murdered. The autopsy also determined that Sarah was pregnant, a condition that had been assumed at the time of the funeral, and which now became a persuasive motive for murder. The suspected father, and therefore likely killer, was a Methodist minister named Avery. It was a time of great cultural change in Fall River, and there was a lot at stake in the outcome of the case. The local textile industry dominated the economy, and it depended on the availability of cheap labor. The region was making a transition from an agrarian to an industrial economy, and women like Sarah had been lured into the mills with the promise that the workplace was as safe as their own homes. The mill owners wanted to see Avery convicted in order to deliver on such promises. The fact that the mill owners were themselves Calvinists, ideological opposites to Methodists, lent added zeal to a crusade which was otherwise entirely economical in nature. Their efforts failed. Even though Avery's own reputation and career were destroyed in the process, his defense was a classic attack on the character of the dead victim, and it succeeded. In effect, it was the low-beam temptress Sarah Cornell, not the elegant adulterer who almost certainly killed her, who stood condemned by the judgment of the jury. But in a broader sense, the mill system stood convicted as well, both for exploiting Sarah's life while she had it, and then for exploiting her death shamelessly. Far away, the most famous case in the distinguished annals of Fall River murder took place on August 4, 1892, when an unpleasant, round-headed Sunday school teacher named Lisbeth was accused of killing her father, a prominent banker named Andrew Jackson Borden, and her stepmother, Abby Durfee Gray Borden. The crime gave rise to an epic piece of doggerel. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her father 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her mother 41, as well as thousands of articles, at least 8 books, several stage plays, a ballet, 2 movies, and apparently endless stream of speculation on her guilt. In one of those films, actress Elizabeth Montgomery stripped down to the buff for the bloodbath, ostensibly to avoid soiling her frock and undies, and certainly to build viewership. In another, Lizzie took the rap for her alleged demented sister Emma. Public attention was so formidable at the time that the venue for the trial was shifted to New Bedford. If she were to be tried again today, it would be hard to raise an unprejudiced jury on Sri Lanka. The panel that finally sat in judgment at her trial consisted of 1 blacksmith and 11 farmers or county tradesmen. Women were not allowed to sit on juries until the following century, although that prejudice in no way diminished their popularity as victims. In part because of the persistence of the jingle, it is easy to forget that Lizzie was found innocent. It probably didn't hurt her case that she came from one of the city's first families, and it certainly helped that she was a single woman, now alone in the world. Plain, old-fashioned luck also played a major role in her trial. Just 5 days before she was to appear in court for killing her father and stepmother, as she languished in the Taunton jail, another axe murder occurred in Fall River. The body of Bertha Manchester, a farmer's wife, was found chopped up in her kitchen. The press reported that a total of 23 distinct axe marks had been counted in the victim. In short, a Portuguese immigrant named José Manuel Carrera was arrested for the crime. José had worked a few days for Bertha's husband. Among other things, he apparently resented the low wages and a steady diet of codfish 3 times a day, and he took his objections to Bertha. Public hysteria at the notion the axe murderer was still at large was only slightly diminished by Carrera's arrest and the subsequent revelation that he was nowhere in the vicinity of Fall River at the time of the Borden killings. Axe murderers are relatively rare, and the latest developments seem to exceed the reasonable probability of an unrelated coincidence. It was still not generally recognized that in cases of great notoriety, and by then the Borden tragedy had achieved the status of crime of the century, deliberate copycat crimes are relatively commonplace. In the course of murdering an innocent woman, Carrera may have helped set a guilty one free. Lizzie Borden lived for another 3.5 decades, variously despised and admired, pitied and feared, but almost universally tolerated even by those convinced of her guilt. Due process had been observed, and even if the result was wrong, it must be abided. In fact, the only open social censure she really encountered, at least from within her own class, was in her later years when she entered what was probably a sexual relationship with another woman. She died 7 years after the enactment of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. Even today, her partisans believed she was born innocently aloft on the wings of angels, and others are equally certain she went straight to hell. Officially, the crime is still unsolved. T-shirts with Lizzie Borden's picture on them are offered for sale throughout the city, and shortly after the Levesque murder, Fall River's new director of tourism said in a newspaper interview that the Borden murders were still the city's best selling point. That rather pessimistic assessment may have been uncomfortably close to the truth. Fall River, which takes its name from a Narragansett Indian word, is a natural deep-water seaport on Mount Hope Bay. Its original prominence as a harbor, however, was eclipsed in the early part of the century by nearby New Bedford, which is still the epicenter of the deteriorating northeast fishing industry. Fall River's industrial epoch began in the 1870s and reached its acme before World War I, when the city boasted 140 operating mills and was the cotton spinning center of the world. But the outstanding characteristics of that era were stubbornness, greed, and accelerated obsolescence. The price of prosperity for a small handful of mill owners was a ravaged landscape and choking pollution, along with exploitation and abject misery for the vast majority of workers. By the start of World War II, 80% of those mills were out of business. Their machinery would no longer function competitively, and they had moved south to escape labor unions. In their wake, they left a plundered, depressed industrial ghost town. More than 20,000 people, some 10% of the population, moved away during the 1950s. Sociologically, what was left of Fall River divided into three parts: the French Canadians living in the east section of the city, known as the Flint, the Portuguese concentrated in the Globe along the waterfront in the south end, and the Irish founding Yankees occupying the area in the northwest behind Main Street and the Highlands. The favored residential motif in the Flint and Globe section of town is the triple-decker tenement of the clusters of flat-roofed, two-story red brick cubes that comprise the city's public housing projects. At the time of the Levesque killing, the most infamous of those projects was on the escarpment above Battleship Cove in the shadow of the Braga Bridge, known as Harbor Terrace. Most of Fall River's single-unit dwellings are contained in the reach toward the city's highlands. But the dominant architectural style is neither civic nor residential, but industrial. And in Fall River, industrial means immense gray stone warehouses and factories seemingly modeled on English prisons, and some as long as several city blocks, deliberately devoid of any concession to the aesthetic sensibilities of the human occupants. In the late 1970s, those stone buildings were rotting heart of the city, and many of them stood empty. The energy of Fall River had moved elsewhere. A lot of that energy had left town forever. Some of it had moved into the bars and the flesh spots around Bedford Street. Carl Drew worked on Bedford Street, starting with a string of armed robberies he committed in that area when he first came down from New Hampshire in his late teens, and later when he returned as a pimp. Alan Sylvia and Tom Joquim worked there too, and so did Doreen Levesque.